On our 7th wedding anniversary, I found a locked drawer in my husband's study. Inside was a $5 million life insurance policy, with my name as the insured and his mistress as the witness. That night I realized, the man I loved wasn't planning our future, he was planning my death. I used to think I had a steady life. At 32, I had a respectable job as a marketing executive in Manhattan, a comfortable apartment in a neighborhood people dream of, and a husband everyone admired. Daniel Parker, 36, was the man people pointed to when they wanted to describe success. Confident, polished, a financial advisor who spoke about investments as if he were building futures, not just portfolios. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made people lean in closer, listen harder. For 7 years, I called him my husband. But comfort, I've learned, can be a lie wrapped in pretty paper. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They were slow, almost invisible at first. Daniel had always been a busy man. "Clients never sleep, Emily," he used to say, kissing my cheek on his way out the door. I believed him when he worked late nights or took calls at strange hours. I told myself his distance was stress, the pressure of his job. That's what a good wife does, right?
She trusts.
She waits. She gives space. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing silence between us. Dinner conversations had thinned to polite remarks. He no longer reached for my hand when we walked. Even the small kindnesses, the texts in the middle of the day, the spontaneous weekend plans, faded like the aftertaste of a forgotten meal. I felt us slipping, but I refused to believe it was anything more than routine settling into the bones of our marriage. Until the night of our anniversary. We had planned a quiet evening. Daniel suggested we stay in, order from our favorite Italian place, and open a bottle of wine. I agreed, thinking maybe it was his way of reconnecting. Something simple, something intimate. He went to take a call while I set the table. That was when I went into his study. I hadn't planned to snoop. Honestly, I was only looking for a good bottle of red. Daniel kept the expensive ones tucked away in the cabinet of his office, locked but not impossible to open if you knew where he hid the spare key. I'd seen him slide it into the back of the desk drawer once, absent-mindedly, and filed it away in memory. That night, with his voice muffled in the bedroom on the phone, I decided I'd surprise him by bringing it out myself. The key turned easily. The cabinet opened with a soft click. And instead of wine, I found a drawer full of files. I should have closed it. I should have respected boundaries, the invisible line that separates curiosity from intrusion. But something in me, some quiet warning, told me to look. My hand trembled as I pulled out the first folder. What I saw made my stomach clench. A life insurance policy. My name printed clearly on the top. The coverage? $5 million. It had been filed just months earlier. My breath caught in my throat. Why would Daniel need such a policy for me, and why hadn't he told me? I scanned further. The beneficiary, Daniel Parker. My husband. But what froze me completely wasn't the numbers or his name. It was the witness signature scrawled at the bottom. Sophia Reynolds. Sophia. I had met her once, briefly, at Daniel's office. A paralegal, I think. Younger than me, late 20s, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything around her. She hadn't been warm, just polite, almost dismissive when Daniel introduced us. I remember thinking at the time that she didn't fit into the polished circle of professionals Daniel surrounded himself with. But I let it go, as I did with so many things. Now her name was here, tied to my death. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? A plan. An investment not in my life, but in my absence. I stood there in the dim light of his study, the city glowing through the window behind me, holding papers that shifted everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The man I shared a bed with, the man I had loved and defended, had turned me into a payout. The sound of Daniel's footsteps down the hall jolted me back. I shoved the papers into the folder and slid it into place, barely closing the drawer before he opened the door. He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "What are you doing in here?" "I was looking for the Merlot," I said, forcing a smile, steadying my voice. "Thought I'd bring it out for tonight." He studied me for a moment too long. My heart thudded against my ribs. Then he smiled, his easy, charming smile, and walked past me to the cabinet. He pulled out a bottle, when I hadn't noticed, and handed it to me.
Here, he said.
This one's better. I took it, nodding, pretending I hadn't seen the file that now burned in my memory, pretending my hands weren't still trembling. That night, I barely tasted the food. Daniel talked about work, about a client who wanted to invest in new tech, about maybe taking a weekend trip to the Hamptons soon. You need some air, he said, pouring me more wine. I smiled and agreed, my face calm while my insides twisted. In bed, I lay awake long after he fell asleep beside me. His breathing was steady, peaceful, as if nothing in the world troubled him. And maybe nothing did. Not when he had a plan. Not when his wife trusted him enough to never look behind the curtain. But I had looked. And now the curtain could never be closed again. At first, I thought about running. The idea of disappearing, leaving behind everything, my job, my friends, the life I had built, clung to me like a lifeline. It would be easier than facing him. Safer. But then the fear hardened. It thickened into something else, something sharper. Anger. Why should I run? Why should I be the one to hide when I hadn't done anything wrong? He had betrayed me. He had lied, cheated, and planned my death as if it were a business deal.
No.
I would not run. I would not give him that victory. If Daniel thought I was his victim, he was wrong. He had drawn the lines of the game, but I was going to play it better. And as I lay in the dark, the city humming outside our window, I whispered a promise to myself. You will not destroy me, Daniel. I will destroy you. The morning after our anniversary, I woke before Daniel. He slept soundly, his arm heavy across my waist, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the papers I had read pressing against my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare let him see the storm behind my eyes. I needed time. Time to think, time to plan. When he finally stirred, I forced a smile. He kissed my cheek and left early for work, saying something about a breakfast meeting with a client. The moment the door closed, I sat up, pressing my hands over my face. My body trembled with fear, but my mind kept racing with anger. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. If he had the nerve to plan something this cruel, he would deny everything and turn it back on me. Worse, he might speed up whatever he had planned. No, I had to be smarter. That day at work, I could barely focus. My coworker Lydia noticed right away. She and I weren't best friends, but she had a sharp eye for people's moods. During lunch, she leaned over and asked, "You okay, Em? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated. Telling her the truth was too dangerous. But Lydia had once told me she thought Daniel was too smooth, and she didn't trust men who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. So instead of telling her everything, I tested the waters. "Do you remember that time you said you saw Daniel downtown with someone?" I asked casually. She frowned, chewing her salad slowly.
Yeah.
That was a couple of months ago. They were at that little French place on Fifth. Looked cozy. Why? My pulse jumped. Who was it? Did you recognize her? Not really. Young. Brown hair, sleek bob.
Pretty in that sharp way.
You know the type. Lydia tilted her head.
Why?
Is something going on? I forced a laugh.
No.
Just curious. He's been working late a lot. But inside, I knew exactly who it was. Sophia Reynolds. That night, I began my quiet investigation. Daniel had always been meticulous with his phone and computer, locking them with passwords I didn't know. But he wasn't flawless. He kept his calendar synced on the tablet we shared in the kitchen, the one he never paid much attention to. Scrolling through it, I noticed recurring lunches and late meetings marked with vague descriptions like client follow-up or strategy. But the locations gave him away: cafes, restaurants, and hotels that had nothing to do with finance. I felt sick. Not only was he planning my death, but he had been living another life right in front of me. The next few weeks were a blur of acting normal while secretly digging deeper. I started checking his mail when it arrived, careful to reseal envelopes. I found receipts tucked in his coat pocket, small carelessnesses he hadn't noticed. And I paid attention to his phone calls, memorizing snippets of names and places. The picture grew clearer. Daniel wasn't just cheating. He was planning a future with Sophia, a future that required me gone. One night, while he showered, I slipped into his study again. My hands shook, but I knew I had to confirm everything. In his desk drawer, I found not only the insurance papers, but also notes scribbled about a trip to the Hamptons. Boat rental. Private dock. Weekend getaway. It clicked then. He wasn't just waiting for the right moment. He already had one planned. My stomach turned cold. He wanted to take me out on the water, stage an accident, and walk away a grieving widower with millions in his account. The betrayal was like a blade twisting deeper every day. But alongside the pain, something else grew: clarity. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't just escape. If I ran, he would find me or worse, try again. No, I had to make sure he paid. That's when the plan began to take shape. I spent my evenings pretending to watch television while secretly studying his habits. I learned what time he left for work, when he checked his accounts, how he stored his files. I started taking notes of my own, hidden inside a blank notebook labeled recipes. I also needed help, but not the kind that would raise suspicion. Lydia became my quiet ally without even knowing it. She loved gossip, and whenever she mentioned seeing Daniel in places he shouldn't be, I asked harmless questions, feeding her curiosity. She thought I was suspicious of an affair, nothing more. That was exactly what I needed her to believe. Slowly, I built my arsenal. I created a separate email account, one Daniel would never find, and began saving copies of everything incriminating. I even learned how to use simple hacking tools to access his emails. It wasn't easy. I stayed up late many nights, my nerves stretched thin, but eventually I got in. And what I found sealed his fate. Messages between him and Sophia, laced with endearments, plans for the future, and hints about after Emily. One line in particular burned into my mind. It'll be quick. Just one trip, and we'll be free. I nearly screamed when I read it. Instead, I saved the emails, screenshot after screenshot, until I had enough evidence to choke him. But evidence wasn't enough. I wanted him destroyed, not just caught. I wanted him to feel the ground fall from under his feet, the way he had pulled it from under mine. So I began planting seeds. I ordered a small vial of fake blood online and used it to stain an old scarf, which I tucked deep inside his car's trunk. I left strands of my hair around the floor mats, like I had been dragged. I set up anonymous emails to myself, making it look like Daniel had written threats. And through his hacked account, I scheduled drafts of emails to Sophia, casually discussing the plan. Piece by piece, I built the trap. During this time, I kept up appearances. At dinner, I laughed at his stories. In bed, I let him kiss me goodnight. When he talked about the Hamptons trip, I nodded like an obedient wife, even adding, "That sounds wonderful. Just what we need." Inside, my rage was a steady flame, burning hotter with every lie he spoke. The turning point came 2 weeks before the planned trip. I overheard him on the phone, his voice low but firm. "Yes, the policy's active. Everything's lined up. We just need the right timing." A pause. Then, "Don't worry, sophomore. Soon." He hung up when he noticed me in the doorway, plastering on his usual smile. "Just a client issue," he said. I smiled back, hiding my disgust. That night I knew. It wasn't enough to save myself. I was going to end him. And when the day came, when he thought he had me right where he wanted me, he would realize too late. The trap he set for me had already been turned against him. The closer the Hamptons trip drew, the harder it became to act normal. Every morning, I woke up beside Daniel and pretended to be the same trusting wife. Every night, I kissed him goodnight, all while knowing he wanted me dead. It was a cruel theater I performed in, but every scene brought me closer to the finale I had already scripted. 2 nights before our romantic getaway, I made my move. Daniel had a late dinner meeting, or so he claimed, and left around 7. I watched him go, smiling, waving from the window as if I were nothing more than a doting wife wishing her husband well. The moment the door shut, I got to work. The first step was disappearing. I had been preparing quietly for weeks. I rented a small cabin upstate using a fake name and cash payments. Nothing traceable. I packed a single suitcase and stored it in the trunk of my car, hidden behind old blankets so Daniel wouldn't notice. I had withdrawn small amounts of money from our joint account little by little, never enough to raise suspicion, but enough to fund my escape. And most importantly, I had created a new identity, Emily Davis. A new phone, a prepaid card, and an email account unlinked to anything he could track. That night, I packed the essentials I hadn't dared to move earlier. My passport, laptop, a few personal things that mattered only to me. Then I staged the rest. I wanted it to look like I hadn't just vanished. I wanted it to look like something terrible had happened. In the kitchen, I knocked over a glass, letting it shatter dramatically across the tiles. I dripped the fake blood I'd bought near the shards, enough to look convincing, but not excessive. Upstairs, I tugged strands of my own hair loose and pressed them into the fabric of my scarf, staining it with more blood before tossing it carelessly into the back seat of Daniel's car. I even scuffed my shoes on the floor near the back door, creating faint marks that could suggest a struggle. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to plant doubt. Then I left. Driving through the quiet night streets of Manhattan, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting Daniel to appear behind me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. But the roads stayed empty, and soon the city lights faded into dark highway stretches. By midnight, I reached the cabin. It was nothing special, just a rundown rental tucked between trees, but to me, it was freedom. It was the first place in weeks where I could breathe without fear of him standing behind me. But I couldn't relax yet. The next phase was just beginning. The following morning, I used my burner laptop to log into Daniel's email, the account I had hacked weeks ago. I set up automatic drafts, scheduled to send in the coming days. Messages to Sophia, written as if from Daniel, spelling out details of the plan. One mentioned me being gone soon. Another spoke about collecting after the trip. I made sure the language was vague enough to seem real but damning enough to spark suspicion. Then I went further. I logged into his financial accounts, which I had gained access to by memorizing his passwords over time. I scheduled odd purchases, a boat rental, supplies near the Hamptons Marina, charges that would tie him directly to the trip. I knew the investigators would follow the money trail, and I was building it brick by brick beneath his feet. But the real trap came from the emails I sent to myself. Anonymous threats, supposedly from him, telling me to stay quiet, or the accident won't look like one. They were crude, but convincing enough when pieced together with everything else. By the second day, the storm was ready to break. I stayed hidden, watching the news on a tiny TV in the cabin. It didn't take long. Wife missing in Manhattan, the headlines read. Pictures of me smiling beside Daniel flashed across the screen, images taken from our wedding and vacations, now plastered under the word missing. Reporters swarmed our apartment building. Detectives questioned Daniel. I knew because I saw it, the grainy footage of him walking into the station, his tie neat, his face composed but pale. And then, the cracks began to show. Police discovered the blood in the kitchen, the scarf in his car, the strange purchases near the Hamptons. Piece by piece, my puzzle took shape. The coup de grace came from Sophia. I had predicted it perfectly. Once she realized the police were circling, she panicked. I had planted enough fake emails to make her look complicit, and she folded under the pressure. According to the news, she told detectives everything. About her relationship with Daniel, about the promises he had made, about the vague hints of a plan she had never really believed. It didn't matter whether she knew the full truth. She was guilty by association, and the moment she felt the heat, she turned on him to save herself. From my cabin, I watched it all unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and cold detachment. My husband, the man who had smiled at me across candlelit dinners, who had once whispered vows of forever, was now branded a monster. A murderer. The day I saw him in handcuffs, escorted out of our building, was the day I let myself smile for the first time in weeks. But I wasn't finished yet. Before disappearing, I had forged documents to access the real-life insurance payout. Daniel had been so careless, thinking himself untouchable, that he never noticed the quiet changes I made in the forms. With Sophia's signature already on record as a witness, it was easy to duplicate what I needed. By the time police froze his assets, the money was already sitting in an account under my new name. $5 million. The number meant less than the victory, but it was still power. Power he had wanted for himself. Now it was mine. Still, I didn't feel relief, not yet. Every night in the cabin, I replayed the scenes in my head. The documents, the betrayal, the plan he had so carefully laid. I thought about how close I had been to stepping onto that boat, smiling, trusting, completely unaware of how little I meant to him. That thought kept me sharp. It reminded me not to grow careless. Because the story wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel hadn't faced trial. Sophia hadn't fully paid. And though the world saw me as a missing woman, a likely victim, I knew the final act still waited. All I had to do was bide my time. From the cabin window, I watched the seasons begin to shift. Leaves curled at the edges, fading from green to amber. Each day, I followed the news with the patience of someone who knew the ending but wanted to savor every step. Daniel was in custody. His face appeared on every screen, once admired, now condemned. The perfect husband, the trusted advisor, exposed as a monster accused of murdering his wife. Only I knew the irony. The woman he had planned to kill was alive, watching his downfall with steady eyes. At first, he tried to play the grieving widower. His interviews were rehearsed, his words dripping with sorrow. Emily was my world, he told reporters, his voice cracking at just the right moment. But the evidence spoke louder. The scarf, the blood, the credit card charges, the emails, the insurance policy. Piece by piece, the mask slipped, and the world began to see him as I did. The police built their case quickly. Too quickly for Daniel to catch up. And then came Sophia. The moment she realized she was in danger of being charged as an accomplice, she flipped. I knew she would. Loyalty had never been her trait. She told detectives everything about her relationship with Daniel, about his promises of a new life together. She claimed she didn't know about the murder plan, but her words painted him guilty just the same. I listened to it all on the evening news, their words dissected by commentators. Every new revelation was a nail in his coffin. What the world didn't know, what Sophia didn't know, was that I had staged the emails she leaned on. The ones that suggested Daniel confided in her about getting rid of me. She thought she was saving herself by cooperating, but in truth, I had written half the story she told. Daniel's trial began 3 months later. By then, I had settled into my new identity as Emily Davis. The cabin was temporary. With the money I had secured, I could start anywhere. Still, I stayed close enough to New York to keep a careful watch. I never attended the trial in person, of course. I couldn't risk being seen. But every article, every broadcast I consumed. The prosecution tore him apart. They presented the life insurance policy as motive. They brought in Sophia as a witness, her testimony damning. The detective spoke about the staged accident, the emails, the evidence of struggle in our apartment. The jury listened horrified. Daniel, for the first time, looked small. Not the confident advisor, not the charming husband. Just a man cornered, flailing, sinking under the weight of his own lies. His defense tried to spin it. They painted him as a man trapped in an affair, guilty of infidelity, but not murder. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that Sophia was bitter, that the police rushed the case. But nothing could erase the mountain of proof I had left behind. I still remember the day the verdict came. I was sitting in the cabin, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, when the news anchor announced it. Guilty. Daniel Parker, once a respected name in finance, sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murder of his wife, Emily Parker. A murder that never happened. I laughed then, not out of joy, but out of something darker. A release. A vindication. He had dug the grave for me, but he was the one who fell in. And Sophia? She walked away with immunity for her testimony. But I didn't need to punish her. Her punishment was living with the truth that the man she betrayed me for had tried to betray her too. She would never escape that shadow. As for me, I was free. The day after the verdict, I closed the cabin for good. With my new name and the money Daniel had once dreamed of collecting, I moved on. A small house in another state. A new job, one that kept me busy but anonymous. I built a quiet life, one where no one asked questions. Yet at night I still thought of him. I imagined him in his cell, the walls closing in, replaying the trial over and over. I wondered if he realized yet that it hadn't been bad luck or coincidence. That every piece of evidence had been placed by my hand. That his brilliant plan had been nothing more than a puppet show, and I was the puppeteer. I almost wished I could tell him, look him in the eye and whisper it was me. I was always 3 steps ahead. But I knew I never would. My power came from silence. From letting him rot, wondering how it had all unraveled so perfectly. Sometimes I replayed our last anniversary dinner in my mind. The way he smiled as he poured my wine. The way he spoke about a weekend trip, as if it were a gift. I remember sitting there, nodding, while inside I was already planning his downfall. That was the last time he ever had the upper hand. Now, when people ask about trust, I think of him. Of how love can be twisted, how greed can rot even the closest bond. But I don't regret what I did. Not for a second. He wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. Instead, I became the author of his end. Daniel Parker will spend the rest of his life behind bars, known as a murderer. Sophia will live with the stain of betrayal. And me? I am alive, free, with a future he never saw coming. My name may not be Emily Parker anymore, but the woman he tried to erase is still here. Stronger.
Sharper.
Untouchable. Sometimes, late at night, I whisper into the darkness. You wanted me dead, Daniel. But I'm the one who buried you. And the silence that follows is sweeter than any vow he ever made.